Welcome, everyone, to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Series, weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. This series is run by the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences of the University of New Mexico and its Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, along with support of the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo. I'm the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenters, you can enter those in the Q&A box. Feel free to enter those anytime that you feel comfortable. Do know that we hold questions until the end, and oftentimes it's not possible for us to get through all of them. In terms of continuing education credits, if you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there is a sign-in sheet in the chat box now that you can click on and enter for your medical education credits. If you are pursuing APA continuing education credits, there will be a link in the chat box, but near the end of the presentation, near the top of the hour. So you'll keep your eye on that chat box, open up, bookmark, copy that link before the webinar closes, and after you complete this, the survey, make sure you save a PDF copy of the certificate that comes after you complete it, because we don't have access to certificates after the fact. The recording for this week's talk is scheduled to be available on our YouTube channel sometime later this week, and a version of PowerPoint slides for those that have registered for the series should be available later this week as well. And as a heads up, next week I'll be discussing the linear sequential unmasking model of reducing bias in forensic science and its potential application to forensic mental health assessment. But circling back to this week, I'm excited to welcome everyone back from this Thanksgiving holiday to introduce you to today's speakers who will be discussing using an eco-developmental framework for forensic mental health assessment with youth on probation. First, we have Dr. Emily Haney-Caron. She is an associate professor of psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center City University of New York. She's also a licensed clinical psychologist in New York and a licensed attorney in Pennsylvania. Dr. Haney-Caron's research, scholarship, and policy work are all focused on the juvenile legal system, with a primary goal of contributing to system reform to increase racial justice and improve the system's developmental appropriateness. She's published research or scholarship on racism and colorism in the juvenile legal system, youth Miranda comprehension, false confession, fines and fees in the juvenile legal system, the school to prison pipeline, developmental immaturity, psychopathology among legally evolved youth, and applications of the risk needs responsivity model to juvenile justice. Most recently, her research is focused on youth plea bargains and youth interrogation. Dr. Haney-Caron regularly conducts forensic evaluations of legally involved youth and emerging adults. She currently serves on the New York State Permanent Judicial Commission on Justice for Families and chairs the American Psychology Law Society's Conference Advisory Committee. We also have joining us Lili Ramos. Lili Ramos is a PhD candidate in clinical psychology at the City University of New York Graduate Center and John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Through her research, Lili aims to inform policy and practice reforms that promote developmental appropriateness and racial equity in the juvenile legal system. Lili's research interests specifically focus on multisystemic factors contributing to adolescents' experiences on probation. In 2022, she was selected for the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Program, which supports her work applying an ecological model to better understand youth success on probation. So Dr. Haney-Caron, Ms. Ramos, Emily and Lili, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, thank you so much for joining our series, and we're excited to hear from you and hear your expertise with us today. I will go ahead and toss it over to you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. We are thrilled to be here. And as should have been clear from the introductions, this work is really spearheaded by Lili. And so I'm thrilled to be along for the ride, but also want to make sure that she's getting credit for, I think, the really impactful ideas that we're hoping to share today. Before we get started, in terms of disclosures, we don't have any financial arrangements that are related to this talk at all. So there's nothing for us to disclose. And then important to note that the views expressed in this presentation are the views of the two of us, and they don't represent views, policies, or positions of the University of New Mexico, nor positions of CUNY. So we are excited to talk to you about our eco-developmental framework for youth probation and how we think it applies to forensic mental health assessment. And also worth noting that we will have an article published very soon in Psychology, Public Policy, and Law on the same topic. So if you're interested in kind of getting more exposure to this after today's talk, please look out for that in the coming weeks. So today we want to start with a little bit of a background on youth probation, to make sure everyone's on the same page, and also to explain why we created this model for youth on probation specifically. And then we'll also provide a little bit of background on eco-developmental frameworks more broadly, and then share the specific framework that we developed for understanding how youth either succeed or experience challenge on their probation experiences. And then we will bring that back to forensic assessment and talk about how we see this model applying to the work that we do as forensic psychologists, and then share some future directions before opening it up for Q&A. So to get started, um, why did we focus on probation? So first of all, probation is by far the most common disposition faced by youth who are involved in the juvenile legal system. And 63% of adjudicated youth receive probation, but I think that suggests a smaller proportion than is really the case, because that is only considering youth who have received a delinquency adjudication. And we know that there are lots of other ways that youth can be put on probation or something that looks like probation, even if we don't call it probation, including a number of different mechanisms of informal processing or diversion where youth functionally are given probation requirements and probation supervision that they have to comply with. And so probation is impacting a large majority of youth involved in the legal system, but not always in a very successful way. So in thinking through what probation looks like for youth, this should be very familiar to most of us. It's quite similar to what adult probation looks like, which I think in some ways is part of the problem, that it doesn't tend to be very developmentally tailored. But youth are, assigned to probation typically when they're living in the community, and they are given a number of probation requirements that they are supposed to follow in order to be considered successful on probation. And that can include curfews or mandated school attendance or drug screens or mental health treatment or pain restitution at really virtually any area of a youth's life or behavior can be impacted by a probation condition. And this may be as few as one condition at a time, or it could be upwards of 30 conditions. It's very dependent on the judge and on the jurisdiction. And then youth are supposed to remember all of those requirements and follow them all perfectly. And they meet with their probation officer periodically to check in on how they're doing with following their requirements. And then they have periodic review hearings in court with the judge, where the judge reviews their compliance with probation and considers whether any conditions should be modified, removed, added, or whether the youth has been successful on probation and is ready to have their probation ended. Unlike with adult probation, typically in the juvenile system, youth are placed on probation for an indeterminate time period. And so they're just continuing on probation, having these review hearings until the judge decides they don't need it anymore. So it's sort of open-ended. And that means that sometimes youth are expected to be engaging in perfect compliance with their sometimes many conditions for a very long period of time. And kids have a really hard time doing that. And so we see that commonly kids receive charges for technical violations. So they're receiving new charges for behavior that is only illegal because it violated a probation condition. And that can lead to really problematic adverse outcomes for youth, including just extended entrenchment in the legal system. And so in thinking about what that looks like, the norm is that youth are struggling on probation. So this varies by jurisdiction and varies by how you measure violation of probation conditions. But research suggests that somewhere between 50 and 90% of youth are struggling to meet their probation requirements. So it's really the rare youth that isn't having difficulty with this. And this isn't just leading to extension of probation. 16% of youth in 2022 were incarcerated for technical violations. And so this means that difficulty with success on probation is leading to youth ending up deeper and deeper in the legal system. And so this is why we felt like it was really important to better understand what sets youth up for success or for failure when they're on probation. And this is especially true because there's a disparate impact for youth of color and also for youth with a low risk of future offending. So youth who probably, if we didn't put them on probation, would do okay, maybe be just fine. They wouldn't be likely to re-engage in offending behavior. When we place them on probation, they often experience worse outcomes. And the same is true for youth of color who experience disparities in how probation responds to them. And so to address these harms for these really vulnerable youth, it's critical to think a little bit differently about how we understand probation. One of the reasons that it's important to look at adolescents on probation, particularly, and not just probation generally, is that developmental factors play a big role in affecting how youth are able to do on probation. So we know that adolescents are characteristically impulsive. So they have a hard time inhibiting impulses, which is necessary to comply with probation requirements. They're very susceptible to pressure, especially peer pressure, which means that conditions that require them to push back against peers may be very difficult. They are very emotionally reactive, which can make following conditions challenging. And they have a hard time weighing risks appropriately. They overemphasize potential rewards, which is really challenging when probation doesn't really provide rewards, but is set up to expect perfect compliance for the hope of someday being released from probation. And adolescents can't really focus on the consequences the way that we'd want them to. And so, for all of these reasons, juvenile probation is especially challenging to folks who are experiencing legal involvement. And traditionally, approaches to looking at juvenile probation have really focused on factors related to the youth and sometimes the youth and the family for understanding what leads to success or what leads to challenge on probation. Um, but we believe that that's missing a big piece of the picture for what's happening for kids. And so we really wanted to come up with a way to reconceptualize how we think about practice and research related to youth on probation. And so we synthesized all of the literature existing on youth probation noncompliance and related areas to try to create a framework based on a theoretical foundation in developmental science. So we applied Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory and other iterations of that theory to conceptualize youth behaviors on probation like more comprehensively within all the different contexts that they navigate. And so we started with Bronfenbrenner's ecological theories, which were first developed in the 1970s, and I'm sure are familiar to the audience. And they're really grounded in the notion that development is shaped not just by factors related to a youth, but also the interactions with and within all of the different environments that impact their lives. And all of these entwined systems impact youth in a way that we'll explain when we go through our model. Um, and this really is a different conceptualization than most research on youth probation takes. And building on Bronfenbrenner's work, there have been subsequent developments, including structural ecosystems theory, which is an ecological model designed to describe and develop interventions for risky youth behavior. And that approach really informed our thinking in this project. And we also thought it was very important to incorporate critical race theory into our understanding of youth probation and how it fits into an ecological framework, because that allows for a much more accurate understanding of how racism and other types of oppression impact youth, not just at the individual level, but also across systems, which we know have big impacts on how youth experience legal involvement and also the outcomes that we can expect them to have. And so I will now pass it over to Lili to get into the model itself and explain each level of the model.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emily, for walking us through some of that background. So now, as Emily mentioned, we wanted to introduce the framework that we developed to you all. And so at the center of every eco-developmental framework is an individual person who has all of their unique internal features. And this model is not meant to be all-encompassing. It's ideally going to be tailored for each person's unique circumstances, but we will be presenting certain factors to consider in relation to probation noncompliance within each of the domains that we walk through. And so a youth's ability to succeed on probation may be supported or limited by their overall developmental immaturity. So as Emily mentioned, we know that youth probation practices traditionally lack a backing in research on adolescent development. And so, for example, success on probation can hinge on developmental skills such as time management, organization, ability to delay gratification. And this is all despite how we know that adolescent behavior is really driven by risks and rewards, sensation seeking, gaining approval from peers, and so on. And so from this, we can see how an adolescent's developmental stage may either help or hurt their success on probation. And then next, a youth's general personality and perspectives on the world likely impact how they approach probation. And so this can include their beliefs about procedural justice and fairness in the legal system, which we know can be impacted by their legal socialization, past experiences with police, the legal system, and many other contexts that I'll discuss more in a bit. And then lastly, in this domain, we can think about how a youth's psychological well-being also shapes their outcomes on probation. And we consistently see that youth on probation report high rates of mental health disorders, trauma exposure, and trauma symptoms, as well as high rates of substance use. And so all of these factors must be conceptualized in the framework alongside the challenges that they're facing with probation requirements. And so then when a youth steps out into the world, they're immediately navigating their microsystems. And so the microsystems are these contexts where they have direct firsthand interaction. And scholarship typically views the family microsystem as the most proximal. And so the youth's parents and family relationships may impact their engagement with probation. And so factors in this domain can look like relationship dynamics in the family, parenting styles, family functioning, overall family processes, and parental involvement. And what we see in the scholarship as well is that parenting and family factors, both broadly and within probation specifically, are impactful on experiences with probation. And then outside of the home, youth spend a lot of time at school, and behavior at school is often a subject of probation monitoring. And so the school domain includes all of the firsthand interactions that a youth has at school. So this involves challenges with school-related probation requirements, so thinking about mandated attendance or requirements around performance at school. We can also think about the impact of police contact at school and experiences of school discipline, which we know are distributed disproportionately to youth of color. And then we also see that scholarship has pointed to how youth on probation face unique challenges navigating school after periods in detention. So thinking about reentry challenges, applying credits, transferring credits, and re-enrolling into schools after periods in detention. And so these are all important factors in the school microsystem to be conceptualizing in the framework. And then in both inside and outside of school, the nature and strength of youth's interactions with their peer groups may also contribute to success on probation. And so this can include both supportive and unsupportive peer and social dynamics. Various dynamics in the neighborhood setting may also shape probation outcomes. So thinking about overall neighborhood resources, public transportation access, the quality of interventions that are available to a youth in the community. So thinking about their access to mental health treatment and substance use treatment, as well as the different types of probation supervision that they're receiving. And then finally, in the microsystem, it's important to think about a youth's firsthand interactions navigating systems. So thinking about the legal system and also the child welfare system if they have contact. Their relationships and dynamics with system staff and the interactions that they have while navigating these systems are all important to be conceptualizing in relation to how they view and interact with probation. And then next, the mesosystems are contexts that are formed by direct interactions between microsystems. So this is without the involvement of the youth. And so the mesosystems can include the degree to which a youth's family collaborates with their school, with the legal system, and with dynamics in their neighborhood or peer group. And this is all to support probation success. In addition, we can also think about how collaborations or the lack thereof between the school and probation systems might also hurt or support probation outcomes. And although research on mesosystems has been relatively limited in scholarship, some studies have looked at how relational dynamics between parents and their child's probation officers shape probation outcomes. There's also been scholarship that's highlighted the importance of parents' advocacy for school success when youth are on probation. And so I think this really illuminates how these mesosystems are often missed, but important factors to be considering here. Next, in the exosystems, these domains refer to interactions in systems where the youth is not directly involved. So we can think about how policies and practices in neighborhood policing, as well as specific probation approaches, can impact how youth navigate probation. We can also think about how school procedures related to discipline are also impactful. So independent of direct contact, the school to prison pipeline may be reinforcing racial disparities in the legal system because of how adolescents' misbehavior at school is handled differently when they're on probation. And across the exosystem, these domains all add really important context on how beyond a youth's firsthand contact in these systems, the foundational policies and practices that are determined in the background all might contribute to their probation outcomes. And then another element of the exosystem has to do with parent factors that are unrelated to the youth. So this can include a parent's overall well-being, including their emotional health. This can also include a parent's employment. So thinking about their job security, their work hours, and financial challenges, how all of these factors can indirectly impact how their child is able to engage with probation requirements. And then here we can also think about factors specific to the youth's defense attorney and how they might impact probation outcomes. So public defense offices are often overburdened so that youth defenders are often carrying really heavy caseloads. And because of that, they're then susceptible to burnout. And we also see in scholarship that youth defenders are vulnerable to secondary trauma symptoms from their work. And all of these factors might shape both the quality of their advocacy for youth and then indirectly impact how the youth is able to engage with probation. Next, the macrosystem refers to broad cultural and social patterns or phenomena. And so the macrosystems likely shape a youth's experiences across all of these other contexts that I've walked through. So thinking all the way down to their individual firsthand interactions within microsystems, back out to their broader system policies, which are all shaped by cultural values and norms. And so in the macro system, we know, for example, that youth of color are overrepresented at every step of legal contact, and the impact of racism and colorism must be actively conceptualized on every level in this framework so that we're fully understanding what's happening when youth violate probation and also how best to respond. And so in this domain, we can also think about how generational traumas and immigration experiences shape probation outcomes, as well as how pervasive sexism and heteronormativity persists in the juvenile legal system, which has been described as patriarchal at its foundations. In the macro system, we can also conceptualize impacts of collective strengths and community level resiliency, as well as resistance to systemic injustice, such as through healing centered engagement and youth led community organizing for social causes. And then now we're going to move on to the last domain in the framework, and this is the chronosystem. And so the chronosystem allows this framework to capture impacts of change over time. And so this can refer to changing probation policies from reform efforts that are trying to improve the developmental responsiveness of youth probation. The chronosystem also includes how life events that happen while youth is on probation impact their ability to succeed. So this might be the loss of a loved one or living through a natural disaster or a global pandemic, all while simultaneously accomplishing probation requirements. And so that sums up the framework. And then now I'm going to hand it back to Emily to go through some of our ideas for implications for forensic assessment.
Okay, so we, developed this model to try to better understand youth on probation. But then we started to think about like what do we do with this? And we have a lot of ideas for how it might apply to forensic work. So first of all, we think that this model has a lot of implications for how we engage in case conceptualization anytime we're doing an evaluation with a legally involved youth who has been on probation in the past or might be on probation related to their present legal involvement. And so first of all, thinking through this model gives us new ways to understand how kids end up on probation in the first place. So typically, those types of examinations focus on the youth and maybe on one or two microsystems, but we'd like to suggest that this should be a much broader analysis, that we should really be considering youth in all of these embedded contexts to understand not just the choices that this youth has made, but also the societal pressures and community pressures that have led them to this position. Because without that greater understanding, we are missing opportunities to intervene in ways that are much more effective for this youth. And we're missing opportunities to really contextualize this youth for the legal actors that need to make decisions in their case. And that also means that this model should be used to conceptualize what goes into youth struggling on probation. So if we only focus on factors specific to the youth and try to address those factors, those interventions may not be as effective as we'd like them to be because we may be missing the larger context that would allow us to shape the youth's environments in different ways. And so if we're thinking about setting youth up for success, we have to think about not just like what probation conditions will allow this youth to have lower risk longer term, but also we should be thinking more broadly, what does it look like to reduce the barriers that the youth has to succeeding at all of the levels of this model? This also means that information gathering and forensic assessment really should be taking place across all levels in the framework. So not just, focusing on the factors related to the youth, but thinking about how can you collect data to help you better understand the norms in the school and how that's shaping the youth's attendance, if that's one of the areas of concern. So I think that this applies to any forensic mental health assessment where you're looking at treatment needs and amenability for youth in the system, any mental health assessment where you're looking at risk assessment, to really be thinking through how can I go beyond the youth and their family and maybe their school attendance to think much more broadly about what is happening for this youth and how I can have a comprehensive picture. That also requires lots of data sources. And obviously, for many of us, that's the norm in how we practice forensic mental health assessment. But I think to utilize this type of framework, we have to get creative and go beyond what we may typically do because it requires really understanding societal and structural forces and how they impact the youth and the family, understanding how the parents' interactions with work are impacting the family. So we have to ask very different questions and potentially look for more sources of information than we may have traditionally used if we want to have this comprehensive understanding. I also think that there are implications for what recommendations we make in reports. If we're writing reports about risk reduction or about treatment needs and amenability for youth in the system, I think we can expect that the effectiveness of our interventions will not be as great if they only address microsystems. And so if we're making recommendations to the court about areas where they might intervene in a youth's life, we need to be thinking much more broadly to interventions that can impact all the pressures that the youth is facing at each level of the model. And also, we should be including in our reports conceptualizations for what it looks like to put this youth on a trajectory out of probation reinvolvement. And that really requires, again, thinking far beyond the youth and the family. So not just recommending, that there be extra school supports, but really understanding why it is that this youth is struggling so much in school and making recommendations that address the challenges within the school system itself. And that kind of shift in thinking much more broadly in this kind of forensic work, I think has potential to much better serve youth and much better serve the legal system to keep youth from cycling back in. Also, this model can be applied when there is noncompliance, and that often is not going to be a forensic evaluator doing that, but perhaps a judge or a probation officer. And so that means that reports that are written at earlier stages in a use case can be an opportunity to educate the legal actors about why it's important to conceptualize a youth in this broader way and to think more systemically and to think at all of these different levels so that when a youth is struggling on probation, the actors who are involved at that stage are able to take a more nuanced lens to understanding what's going on and to thinking really creatively about how to intervene, perhaps beyond the traditional tool set that has been used in the past. And so we really think that there's opportunity for reports to be a tool to educate the court regarding conceptualizing youth in this manner. And so to make this a little bit less theoretical and kind of give an example of what we mean in practice, we want to provide a case example for how a framework can be applied for one youth. So we're going to talk about Michael, who is a hypothetical youth, an amalgamation of lots of kids that we've worked with or evaluated over the years. So Michael is a 16-year-old Black boy living in New York City. He's currently in detention due to concerns related to public safety and court attendance, given his past legal record. So his past record involves a simple assault adjudication, as well as a history of probation noncompliance related to violation of a school attendance condition, related to a positive urinalysis, and also related to missed probation meetings. And Michael's present charges are for robbery in the third degree. Michael has been referred to a forensic mental health evaluator for an evaluation to provide analysis of his risk level for future offending, as well as to make general recommendations to the court about his treatment needs and his likely responsiveness to intervention by the court. And so if you take a kind of traditional classic risk assessment approach to thinking through this case. This is obviously very little information that we've given you, but you probably spot a number of risk factors just from what we've presented, right? So we would be concerned about his risk of future offending because of his past legal involvement, which is especially concerning given that it seems like there's a history of violence and person-related offenses. His poor compliance is a significant risk factor for reoffending. So is his school disengagement, his substance use, particularly as it's impacted his legal case, seems like a risk factor for reoffending. And then this is suggestive of a poor attitude toward intervention given these missed meetings. And so, that classic approach certainly would collect lots more data, but is very focused on Michael himself and perhaps doesn't go much beyond Michael and his family. We'd like to propose a different way of doing this. So, certainly considering all of those risk factors that we would normally consider, but then also going quite a bit beyond that to think at each of these levels what this looks like and how the court can best understand Michael's legal involvement and his likely trajectory. So, starting at the level of the youth, it turns out that Michael has an ADHD diagnosis, but his ADHD has gone untreated for reasons that aren't immediately obvious, but I think will be clear at other levels. And because of his difficulty with attention and impulsivity, he's had a really hard time remembering his probation requirements and his appointments and following through on them. And all of that has created a lot of stress for Michael. And given that stress and also his untreated ADHD, he started managing his stress with cannabis use. And that resulted in a probation violation for failing a urinalysis, even though his original offense was completely unrelated to substance use. He still was just given that cookie cutter condition and failed to meet it. Um, Finally, at the youth level, Michael is very distrustful of the legal system, and that includes his attorney and the judge and his probation officer. And that's really shaped his willingness to engage with all of these legal actors and to confide in his probation officer about the challenges that he's facing, which again will become clear as we move to the other levels of the model.
Yeah, so moving on to the microsystem level, Michael lives with his mother. She's a busy single mom who wants to be there for her son and help however she can with probation, but she is unfortunately often unable to provide much time or help with managing probation appointments or expectations. Michael lives in a neighborhood with relatively poor access to public transportation. So, because of that, he's often unable to attend doctor's appointments to get medication refills for his ADHD treatment. Also, because of these transportation challenges, Michael has had difficulty getting rides to probation offices for appointments. And relatedly, in the past, he has had poor relationships with probation officers because of this. In the school microsystem, Michael attends a a school that's under resourced. His classes are large, and because of that, he has limited access to the academic and classroom supports that he needs to address his learning needs. While he's had several supportive teachers and mentors at school and through recreational sports over the years, Michael has recently experienced both overt and subtle forms of racism from teachers, which has contributed to his overall disengagement at school. And in the past, Michael had previously thrown his earbuds at a teacher after a racially charged microaggression. And this is what prompted his prior simple assault charge that we'll get into a little bit more.
At the mesosystem level, as Michael has been navigating probation, he started to realize that there's a lot of tension between his mom and his probation officer. And that really increased his mistrust in the legal system as a whole and in probation specifically. The probation officer, it turns out, had repeatedly criticized Michael's mom and chastised her for not being sufficiently involved in his probation and his legal case. But we know at the microsystem level that this is because of her status as a single mom and need to work multiple jobs to support the family. Probation doesn't seem to care that this is due to mom's work schedule. The school also has disregarded mom's schedule and repeatedly scheduled Michael's 504 plan meetings at a time that his mom can't attend because of her work obligations. And then the school documents her lack of involvement in the 504 plan. And so the school's moving forward with 504 planning, lacking critical information about the supports that Michael actually needs, which has made his plan less effective. The school also has called Michael's probation officer each time he's had any minor behavioral infraction in school. And then Michael gets a lecture from probation as a result. And that means that Michael doesn't feel like he can trust anyone at school. Partially because of that, his attendance has dropped significantly, and that resulted in a probation violation of his school attendance requirement. And it also meant that he was spending much more time in the community during school hours, which led him to become involved with delinquent peers. And those are the peers that he was with for his recent robbery charge.
So next in the exosystem, we can think about the systems that indirectly impact Michael's probation outcomes. So this includes probation policies and practices that are standard. So such as requiring substance use screening for all youth on probation, even though, like in Michael's case, none of his charges or presenting issues were related to substance use. In Michael's jurisdiction, probation departments also don't offer rides or transportation support for youth. And so this is further added to his difficulty attending appointments and getting to where he needs to be to complete requirements and get the mental health interventions that he needs. In the school setting, Michael's school has standard practices surrounding when teachers notify school resource officers. So this has led to Michael's initial charge and enacted the school to prison pipeline in his case. And so we can think about how these school policies and standard practices are playing out here. In the neighborhood, Michael has experienced the impacts of policing norms surrounding racial profiling. So he's had frequent, unnecessary, and aggressive police stops, all while going about his daily activities. And this has contributed to his sense of mistrust in the legal system and also to poor relationships with legal actors. And then finally, in the exosystem, we've touched on this a bit, but thinking more about Michael's mother's circumstances. So she works 2 jobs that have limited flexibility for missed or modified hours. And this has all significantly impacted her availability for probation appointments.
At the macro system level, we find broader systemic explanations for many of the things that are playing out in Michael's neighborhood and in his life. So the legal system has viewed the neighborhood that Michael lives within as a risk factor for future offending, and in some ways framed it as a deficit in the choices that Michael's mother has made in parenting him, that she's chosen to live in this neighborhood. In reality, Michael's neighborhood is under-resourced because of a history of redlining, and that has directly impacted the services that Michael can access, as well as his ability to get public transit probation appointments, and really illustrates the impact of structural racism on Michael's probation outcomes, including historical racism that now trickles down to shape what his daily life looks like. The community also has a youth advocacy organization that is a source of strength in the community, and that could be leveraged to get Michael services if we are thinking sort of more systemically, potentially beyond the resources that would typically be utilized. Within Michael's school, there's a pervasive culture of bias. And so the microaggressions that Michael has been experiencing throughout the school day are really coming from that more systemic level and from the school culture. And so that created the conditions for this interaction with the teacher that resulted in Michael's initial charge for simple assault when he threw earbuds at his teacher. And this culture of racial bias within the school system likely also shaped the resource officer's response to Michael, and that incident led not to a disciplinary action, but instead to legal system involvement. Within the legal system, Michael is 16 years old, but he's viewed by legal actors as older than 16. They perceive him as more mature and as older and larger than white youth of the same age. And that means that he has been given fewer chances to mess up. He's been treated more punitively than white youth facing similar charges and under similar circumstances. And Michael is aware of those experiences within the legal system, even if he's not aware of the structural kind of reasons that those exist. And that has further increased his distrust in the system, which is shaping his response to probation and presenting a roadblock to his success on probation.
And then so to end with the chronosystem, we can think about all of the ongoing events related to Michael's probation involvement. So the COVID-19 pandemic began when Michael was in 5th grade, and the shift that occurred to remote learning limited his access to the academic accommodations that he needs related to his ADHD. And so this disrupted his academic trajectory, and we've seen lasting impacts throughout his middle school and high school years. Since he's been on probation, Michael has also had to quit his community football league because of other probation obligations that were filling much of his time. Michael was an aspiring professional football player, and he had developed many pro-social relationships with both peers and coaches, and many of these relationships were then disrupted once he became involved with probation. And then lastly, during his time on probation, Michael's grandmother passed away, and she was a primary caregiver for Michael and often filled in for Michael's mother when she was unable to attend appointments and help with Michael's general caregiving. And so this loss in the family really took an immense toll on Michael's overall well-being and also his engagement with his legal obligations as well. And so the goal of this example was really to summarize how the framework needs to be individualized for each youth's specific circumstances. And the other goal was to illuminate how much deeper of an understanding we can gain about Michael's compliance on probation when applying this conceptualization. So with this understanding, we can adopt a more nuanced approach to targeting interventions that are responsive across all of these systems that we've gone through that impact Michael's probation outcomes. And so in addition to some of these clinical implications for forensic assessment that we've walked through, we also feel that this framework has led to some broader reflections on much needed areas for policy and practice reform related to youth probation. And so overall, the framework highlights how many environmental factors can truly impact a youth's ability to succeed on probation. And so this raises a need to reform how youth is generally carried out for youth. And so in addition to larger ongoing systemic shifts to increase the developmental appropriateness of probation, the dynamic nature of this framework also underscores how information about a youth's context should be obtained periodically. So rather than just at intake or after violations, it needs to be continually reassessed. And to do this, it may require more training opportunities for different legal actors across the system. So thinking about how we can train everyone to work with youth in ways that address trauma history, that address potential biases and developmental needs, and so on. And then lastly, the overall inefficacy of traditional probation approaches and this reality of how many factors can truly shape probation outcomes for youth really highlights a need for increased attorney representation after dispositions to make sure that youth have advocacy when violations occur, and also to help ensure that interventions are responsive to each of the youth's individual circumstances. Also making sure that these interventions are targeting different needs that arise throughout probation involvement. And then creating this framework has also illuminated many future directions for research. And so we'll only have time to briefly touch on a few here. But first, we felt that it was important that research continues to attempt to evaluate this model. So we feel that the framework should be applied to examine contributors to probation compliance, not just in microsystems where there's been more attention in the literature, but also in these broader domains as well that we've talked about. This framework has also highlighted to us how research on youth probation has relied on a range of operationalizations for these outcomes. And so despite how self-reported noncompliance and formally charged violations capture conceptually distinct variables, we see that a lot of studies are interpreting probation noncompliance in these different ways. And then these differences in how probation noncompliance has been measured differently also requires further exploration to be able to truly disentangle trajectories of racial disparity in probation processes. And so in this area and across the whole framework, there's a real need to be conceptualizing the role of racism within every domain of the framework. And so this should include examining how multisystemic forms of racism impact probation outcomes through both indirect and direct mechanisms. And it's also important that this is captured from different perspectives. So, in making sure to include perspectives of youth on probation and their families directly. And then lastly, this research there's been relatively little research that's focused on the role of trauma across ecological systems. And so we feel that this represents a pretty notable gap and important future direction. So, for example, this might look like thinking more about roles of bullying and peer violence at school on probation outcomes, or impacts of intergenerational trauma and family separation related to mass incarceration in the US. And so we wanted to illuminate some of these ideas for future research, but that concludes the presentation that we prepared for today. And we would love to open it up to the audience for questions, but we appreciate you all being here today.
Yes, and thank you so much, Lili and Emily, Ms. Ramos, Dr. Haney-Caron, for not only going through all these different steps and this framework approach, but I know that a lot of the practitioners in this webinar series are a big fan of illustrating some of these models through case examples. So I know that resonated with a lot of people here. So thank you for a discussion and also helping us illustrate how this might present in practice with an individual youth on probation. We do have a number of questions already in the chat. Of course, if you have any other questions, you can enter those in the Q&A box anytime you feel comfortable. Also, the chat box does have the APA continuing education link. Go ahead and bookmark that link, copy it if you are pursuing APA continuing education credits. That link is available now. So somebody wanted to preface saying they love the presentation and they are in this area saying you are preaching to the choir, saying and thinking about how to assess for elements of a youth's broader ecology. I wonder if you have any thoughts or suggestions on how to actually gather that information. For example, are there any good data dashboards on neighborhood or community level redlining, access to medical mental resources, any availability of basic necessities like grocery stores, any practical things you have in terms of how one might actually gather this info at all these different levels?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, I think one that we're still grappling with, and it's a work in progress. I think I don't have any like specific resources to offer. I think having done this work has really shifted how I think about my obligation to understand the communities that I practice in. And so I am trying to learn a lot more about the communities where I tend to assess kids, so that even without sort of a database to look it up in, that I talk to community organizations and community members about what those historical practices look like and how they've shaped the community. I think it also, in terms of like community resources that are available, I've found that the social workers embedded within public defense offices and places where that resource exists are an incredible source of knowledge. And so, sort of separate from working on a case, just seeing if you can find time to meet with the folks who are responsible for sort of keeping track of what is available in the community, to talk through what those community level pressures and sort of systemic impacts look like, but also the resources available that may not be like typical go-tos of the court system, but that can be sources of community strengths. And I think community organizations themselves are, in so many communities, doing really critical work to try to create opportunities for kids, and are very open to sharing the knowledge that they have and sharing the larger systemic understandings that they have. And it may be, that there is something that you can also offer to that organization in exchange for that bigger picture knowledge. And so I don't think of that as something that's like data collection on a specific case, but perhaps the work of kind of really having a deeper dive of what communities that you work in look like, and what have shaped them, so that you have that information when you do have a specific youth to think through how to apply it. Lili, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. I feel like it's giving a lot of really valuable ideas for future resources to develop. I'll add from a more research perspective, which would have great clinical implications. There's an interesting article by Erica Fountain that used GIS mapping to use data mapping basically to illustrate structural barriers to probation access. It was created for just one jurisdiction, but I think in an ideal world, we would have that for every jurisdiction, just seeing how, based on different zip codes, different access to transportation and other neighborhood barriers all impact probation. But I think it's an excellent direction.
Wonderful. Thank you for discussing that with us. Somebody also adding that they really appreciate the framework and how they could see how this could help people conceptualize youth and their needs. Their question gets at interested in who would actually be or seeing this applied and implemented. What's your recommendation in, say, who would complete a model like this or map it out? And their examples are, would this be used by a psychologist or mental health professional in, say, juvenile detention, a member of a placement authorization team, a liaison that services between the court and the youth? They add there, additionally, is there training for this model, or what skills might be needed to ensure that people that were going to implement or use this model do so with fidelity and attention to the specific details that you've suggested be considered?
Yeah, I think all of those people should be thinking about youth in this broader way. And it'll be really jurisdiction specific in terms of what the structures and processes look like in that jurisdiction. But I think this can be done by a forensic mental health evaluator who's giving input on the case. This can be done by somebody within the probation department at intake. I think there's so many different actors who could be doing this kind of work. And I think they all should be. And that if everybody is sort of picking up on some of the pieces together, then we end up with a comprehensive picture of the kid before us. I, in terms of training, there is not. It's a brand new thing that we, just came up with. But I also think it's not all or nothing. So it's possible to just start by making sure that in every evaluation you're asking questions that are, going to get at those pieces like within, the exosystem and the macro system that like maybe would typically be missed. And so, you start with that and then you build out your understanding of the systemic structures that have impacted the communities that you're working in. Like I think you can do it piece by piece and over time sort of build out a more nuanced and complete approach to how you think about youth in the system.
And just
Wonderful.
I
Go
was
ahead.
going to add a quick note that another goal for this work is to tailor these trainings for different people working in the system. And so our hope is that we can work with this training to make it more relevant for attorneys, for judges, for everyone. Just because I think there are implications for different people.
And along those lines of thinking about the perspectives or the vested interests of people that this could impact, I know there are several people in the audience that do say mitigation consideration evaluation, sentencing considerations for youth, and somebody asks about how would you go about writing or testifying about things like race, microaggressions, critical race theory related issues when they seem important but might not be well received by a particular court. In their situation, they're thinking of a small southern county known for more punitive and conservative viewpoints on justice and youth. As we know, in some areas, sometimes things that we perceive or are associated with mitigating risk are nonetheless by others interpreted as an aggravating risk factor. So I guess how might you consider communicating these in a way that could be received by courts that might look at them differently?
I don't think I have a perfect answer, and I also have never practiced in a small southern county. So lots of caveats that like I am not the expert on this. I have felt a lot of trepidation in my own forensic work for like how do I introduce these really critical ideas in a way that the court will be receptive to. And the way that I've settled on is by really grounding it in the research literature. So I've started adding research literature like sections to my reports to really flesh out this information. And then I apply it back to the youth in this case. But I first presented as just like, here's what we can learn from the literature. With lots of citations as its own sort of separate section so that it's not so much like here's what you're doing wrong with this youth. It's like big picture, what do we know in the science in this area? And I've found that that seems to go over pretty well. I think better than an approach of just only doing the application piece and not kind of giving the background for like why do we need to care about this? Why does it matter in this case? But that's obviously like super judge dependent, and in some cases, I think you do have to find ways to make the recommendations that are driven by your full conceptualization with perhaps not connecting all the dots about what has, you know, like all the historical impacts that have led you to have this thinking. Perhaps there are courts where that just is not doable.
Well, we have reached the top of the hour. So, Dr. Haney-Caron, Ms. Ramos, Emily, Lili, thank you so much. One, of course, for the work that you do in this area, as well as discussing a broader model that we could see also be implemented and impacted on so many different levels with so many different people that operate with youth on probation. So, thank you, and best of luck with your continuing work and continuing impact on this area. And thank you for sharing all of this with us today.
Thank you for having us today.
Thank you so much. We really enjoyed it.
And that wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. Next week, you're stuck with a long hour with me as I will be discussing the linear sequential unmasking model of reducing bias in forensic science and its potential application to forensic mental health assessment. We hope to see you then next week for another great discussion of issues in behavioral health and the law. Until next time, take care.